Thank you all for your attendance today. My name is Shannon Crosby, and I'm a registered dietitian with CoxHealth Wellness. And today I'm going to present to you how much protein do I need. Protein is a really hot nutrient right now. Have you heard of, the Atkins diet's been around for several decades, the paleo diet? There are all kinds of different high protein diets that are out there. People are trying them out. They're paying attention to what their favorite celebrities and sports stars are eating, and it seems like it's protein. There's been an explosion of products that have protein added to them or protein highlighted in the marketing of those products. Protein powders and protein bars and protein shakes are in our supermarket shelves. And so today I'm going to address the question, how much protein do I need? Am I eating enough? And we'll kind of start out too by talking about what exactly protein is and talk about the food sources of protein and how it can fit into a healthy meal pattern. So first, let's start off with the science and find out what exactly is protein. Well, it's a really important nutrient. It's one of the 6 classes of nutrients that humans require for survival. Water is the number 1 nutrient that we need, and then we have 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats that give us energy, and then we have vitamins and minerals, which we don't get energy from directly, but provide health benefit as well, and we need them for survival. Proteins are the primary component of all the cells in the body. They make up about 17% of our body weight, and they're found in muscle, in our organs and tissues, hormones, enzymes, DNA, and much, much more. Proteins are made of chains of amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids that we gain a benefit from our food. 9 of those are considered essential, which means that we have to get them from our food. And then the other 11 we can make from the foods that we eat, from those essential ones. So 9 are essential, and if we do not get all of those 9 amino acids in our diet, then our body will start to break down protein in order to get that. And that's where we start to see muscle wasting. There are many different important functions of proteins, and some of these you probably are already familiar with working in the medical field. They provide a structural support for our cells and our tissues. Proteins synthesize enzymes and are required to produce hormones like insulin. We have antibody proteins that are really important for our immune system. We have proteins that help regulate fluid balance in the body. Albumin and globulin are 2 proteins that draw water, and so that keeps water from pooling in the interstitial spaces and causing edema or swelling. We have proteins that help to regulate acid-base balance and pH in the body. And finally, proteins help transport other nutrients that we need across the cell membrane. So proteins have a lot of really important functions, and it's it's not surprising that they're so important in our diet. So where do we get proteins? Well, lots of different foods contain protein. The foods that you're probably the most familiar with as being protein containing are meats. And so any type of meat or fish, poultry, we're going to get a significant amount of protein from. We also get a significant amount of protein from animal foods, animal products like milk products or eggs. So those are very high protein sources as well. But we don't have to get protein from animals. We can get protein from plant foods as well. Nuts are fairly high in protein, seeds, soybeans, quinoa. In fact, grains are a fair supplier of protein to the American diet. We also get a little bit of protein from vegetables. The only food groups that really don't contain protein are fruits and fats. We're not going to get protein from those. However, not all food protein is created equal. Some food sources are what we consider a higher quality source of protein than others. And so one of the ways that we can measure that is with the term biological value. And biological value is a way that we can measure how well we utilize the proteins in those foods and use them for our own body functions. So for example, egg white protein, egg albumin, is the highest quality food protein that we can consume. When we consume egg white protein, we utilize 100% of those amino acids for our own body processes, okay? When we consume other types of animal products, like a whole egg or dairy products, they have a very high biological value. 84 to 93% of those amino acids are utilized. The egg is a little bit lower than the egg white because there's not as much high quality protein in the yolk. Now, you can see on down the list, we've got soybeans at 72.8, rice at 64, even wheat at 64. So those are plant proteins that have a higher biological value. Quinoa is going to be up there similar to soy. And then corn and other types of vegetables, beans, are going to be a little bit lower than that. Just because a food protein has a high biological value doesn't mean that those are the only types of proteins you should eat. You can still get all of your 9 essential amino acids and get enough protein from eating plant sources. And I'll talk about that a little more in a moment when I address vegetarianism. But it's a little bit easier to get all of those amino acids from those higher biological value proteins. All right, now that gets us to the question, how much protein do we actually need? Well, we can look at the dietary reference intakes to help us kind of come to that conclusion. The dietary reference intakes are tables of values of different nutrients and how much we need at different life stages. And these come in different forms, but probably the most common one you may have heard of are the RDAs, or the recommended daily allowances. Those tell us how much protein are we actually going to need. And the RDA, which it's recommended dietary allowance, the RDA for protein is based on weight. And so you could calculate your own protein need according to the RDA, which is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And that would be the amount that you would need in a day. It's kind of seen as the basic amount, okay? You wouldn't want to go underneath that. So to figure out your weight in kilograms, you would want to take your weight in pounds and divide that by 2.2. That gets you your weight in kilograms, and then you would multiply that times 0.8, and it would give you the amount of protein in grams. So for those of you who don't have a calculator or who aren't well at multiplying in your head, I've put the amount of protein required for 4 different weights up there. So you could kind of see where your weight would fall and estimate the amount of protein that you would need in a day. Most people, when they see this, think, that's pretty low, right? That's not that much protein. And like I said, this is kind of the minimum amount that you would require to make sure that you have enough protein for those functions that I mentioned earlier. These are established by the Food and Nutrition Board, which is a part of the United States Department of Agriculture. It's a group of leading nutrition researchers that gathers the literature and looks at the need for various nutrients to establish those numbers. Now, as a point of reference, in the United States today, men consume on average about 100 grams of protein a day. Men consume about 100, and women consume about 70 grams. And so we're doing pretty well when it comes to the RDA and protein. We're meeting that without any problems. Protein isn't typically thought of among nutrition clinicians as being a problem nutrient unless somebody's in a disease state and their protein needs are even higher. Now, when I was doing research for this presentation, one of the interesting things that I found out is that there's some evidence that as we get older, the ability of our bodies to utilize the protein from our food starts to diminish. We know that as we age, due to hormone changes, we naturally start to lose muscle mass. We lose about 2 to 3% every decade after we turn 30. In the younger years, our hormones, growth hormones, sex hormones help to keep protein synthesis very high, which you would want to see in childhood and adolescence and even in young adulthood. But once we hit 30, that starts to decrease, those hormones do, and we start to see a decline in muscle mass. And unfortunately, most of us are going to replace that muscle mass with fat tissue. And the only way we've thought to really keep that up is by exercising and weightlifting as we age, to try to keep that lean muscle mass high. But some of the evidence that I found indicates that consuming a little bit higher protein diet can help to preserve some of that muscle mass. And in this study in particular, we were looking at people over the age of 65, and it was determined that the optimal amount of protein for this group to maintain muscle mass was 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day. Okay, so you would do the same thing, figure out your weight in kilograms, multiply times 1.2, and I also listed some average amounts for various weights up there. So this is really more similar to the meal pattern that we are eating already, 70 grams a day for women, 100 grams a day for men. So at this point, there's not really enough evidence to increase the RDA for protein. It's still set at 0.8, but this is starting to show some evidence that perhaps in the future those numbers might be altered. And then another thing that we would need to look at is how those protein needs might change as we hit our 30s and our 40s and 50s. It's probably somewhere between the 0.8 and the 1.2 mark, but we don't have that research at this point. Now, there is a group who might, other than people who are ill or recovering from illness, who might need a higher protein, and that would be people who are trying to gain muscle mass through pretty intensive weight training. So if somebody's trying to gain weight and make sure that that weight is muscle, and they're wanting to build muscle to get stronger for an athletic event, there's evidence that protein intake as high as 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight is beneficial in that case. Do we need more protein than that? It's not uncommon for me to talk to clients who've been told that they need more protein than that, even as high as double. Oftentimes that advice comes from gym trainers or personal trainers, or maybe advice that they found on the internet or in like a muscle magazine and so on. Do we really need more protein than that? You know, and what happens when we consume protein at amounts higher than that? First, there really isn't good evidence that eating protein in intakes higher than what I've mentioned today is that beneficial. In fact, when we consume protein in excess, we break it down, we're able to use it for energy, and then most of it is just lost in the urine. And so there's not really a benefit to consuming protein in amounts higher than that I have been able to find. Some experts will cite that a high protein diet is hard on the kidneys and can lead to dehydration. And this is true that our kidneys have to process the protein and break it down and eliminate it in our urine, so they do work harder to do that with a high protein diet. And that process can lead to dehydration. However, I haven't seen good evidence that that's going to harm somebody long term who's healthy. We know that's going to harm somebody potentially who has some kidney damage or kidney disease. But in a healthy person, there's not good evidence to indicate that it's harmful, although we do have a lack of long-term studies that have looked at that. Some of the other benefits of eating what I'm going to refer to as a moderate protein diet. So a moderate protein diet is probably somewhere around that 1.2 grams per kilogram mark. It's not going to be a super high protein diet like Atkins, which is what I would consider a high protein diet. So if we're looking at a moderate protein diet, there were some other studies that I found that had some really interesting results as to the benefits of consuming protein in that amount. And one of them is that people who eat protein at a moderate protein level ate less energy from food than people who were on a lower protein diet. So the amount of energy that they ate was 200 calories per day less. So in this study, they had two groups, one eating moderate protein, one eating low protein, and the moderate protein group ate less. So 200 calories isn't a huge difference, but they did this without counting calories. So it's something that just they naturally felt less hungry. Okay, so we know that eating a little bit higher protein, a moderate protein diet, seems to contribute to satiety or feeling of fullness, and that can cause us to eat less. So that's pretty important if we're trying to maintain a healthy weight or even lose weight. Moderate protein diets have also been shown to be beneficial because it takes more energy to break down protein in the body metabolically than it does to break down carbohydrates and fats. We're more efficient at using carbohydrates and fats for energy. So it makes sense that if we increase the amount of protein that we are eating in our diet, that's going to help with that thermic effect. Thermic effect is the energy required to break down those nutrients is going to be a little bit higher for protein. So that can create a difference too in the amount of energy that you're taking in and can help with weight loss or weight maintenance. Another really important finding that I discovered was that protein has a better long-term compliance among dieters. And so they took 2 groups of people, and they had one on a moderate protein diet and one was on a more traditional low-fat, low-calorie diet for weight loss. And they found that the people on the moderate protein diet had much better compliance with the diet long-term than the people who were on the low-fat, low-calorie diet. So that's really important. As a dietitian, probably one of the biggest issues with changing your eating habits and trying to lose weight is sticking with it for a longer period of time. And so perhaps eating a more moderate protein diet can help with that. I found some research by a man named Donald Layman, and he looks at the timing of protein in a meal pattern. So a meal pattern is, do you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Do you eat snacks, et cetera? And how do you kind of divide the food up that you eat in a day between those different meals and snacks. What he did was compared subjects who were eating a traditional American diet, which would be protein intake on the right, with a lower protein breakfast, a little bit higher at lunch, and then a very high protein meal at dinner time. This is the typical pattern. And then he compared that against subjects who ate 30 grams of protein at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So we have the same total amount of protein, 90 grams, but just changed the meal pattern. And what he found was that this impacted muscle protein synthesis. People who ate the more consistent protein meal pattern had enhanced muscle synthesis versus people who were eating a more typical American diet. So this is important for us as we age. If we're trying to preserve muscle mass as we get older so that we can maintain our activities of daily living, and we're trying to not have our tissues turn from muscle to fat, this can be really important. We might need to eat a little bit higher protein meal at breakfast and lunch, and then a little bit lower at dinner to keep those levels consistent. Again, we think that meal pattern on the right doesn't impact younger people as much because of the hormone response. So I put some examples here of some 30-gram protein meals because 30 grams of protein for most of us seems like a really high amount, especially at breakfast. So, for example, 2 eggs with some vegetables and a serving of Greek yogurt gets you to close to 30 grams at breakfast. And so it's not that you have to eat a huge amount of food or really eat any special foods. You just have to have a little more careful planning and pay attention to making sure you're getting in those protein servings. And if you want some help with this, feel free to email me because I have all kinds of different recipes and meal plans that are going to have maybe not all exactly 30 grams, but 20 to 30 grams. I use 20 grams a lot of times with my weight loss clients who are mostly women trying to lose weight. And so I'm always looking at 20 to 30 grams for them. Now that brings us to protein supplements. Do I need a protein supplement? Should I be spending money on this? The protein supplement industry is just exploding. I mean, this is projected to be a $9 billion business within the next few years. And it's an industry that's just seen tremendous growth. I mean, we've got the traditional protein powders that have been around for quite a while. Used to be the gym rats that were taking those, the bodybuilders, but today it's not uncommon for soccer moms and all kinds of people to be taking protein supplements. We've got protein bars, and then I've seen a real explosion of products on the right, which are maybe more familiar products to us that now contain protein. Protein's been added to them, or on the packaging, protein is highlighted in order to market those products. So people are looking for protein sources, and they're looking at them in the grocery aisle. Now, most of these protein supplemented foods are going to get the protein from dairy, and it's whey protein that is taken from cow's milk. And so that's the most common protein source. And whey protein that's been isolated has a very high biological value. It has a biological value of 100. And so these are high quality protein sources, and that we're going to utilize that protein very, very well. Sometimes you can find protein products that use soy protein as the source, and those I'm not as big of a fan of, just because there's some issues with a certain phytonutrient that's in soy products called isoflavones that seems to act as like estrogen in the body. And so it's not really recommended for people with a history of breast cancer or a strong family history of breast cancer. And there are issues too with men taking those. So I would kind of stay away from products that use soy protein. Not that eating soy foods is bad for us, but whenever it's in a processed product like this, it's isolated and concentrated, and you're going to take in more of that. That being said, and if you've heard me talk before, you probably aren't surprised that I'm not really a big fan of protein supplements. I'm not really a big fan of supplements in general. As a dietitian, I always recommend that people get their nutrition from food. When we eat whole foods, we get so much more than just protein. We get fiber, we get vitamins, we get minerals, we get phytonutrients, we get the benefit of other nutrients that are in the food. Our bodies recognize chewing and eating food in a very different way than drinking a supplement or taking a supplement pill. So that's probably the main reason I would recommend looking for food first to get your protein. And it's not difficult to do, like I said, with just a little bit of planning and preparation if you're trying to increase protein at different meals. These products too sometimes have other things with them besides the protein that might not be so good for us. Number one, calories. If you're trying to lose weight or maintain a healthy weight, you have to pay attention to the energy in these foods because it counts too, even though these are healthy. So you got to look at that. You got to look at, is there any extra sugar added or any other additives that might not be good to include in a healthy diet. And then another issue that's been brought to light by a fairly recent Consumer Reports investigation is that many of these protein products have other harmful metals added to them inadvertently. It's probably just something that gets included in the manufacturing process. They tested a number of whey protein supplements that you would use to make a shake or a drink, and they found that a significant number of them contained lead, mercury, and cadmium, which are all harmful metals that we shouldn't be ingesting. So that's another issue too. That kind of brings me to this next slide where I wanted to just show you how it's not difficult to consume high protein from food. And so I have the example of a 170-pound man who's trying to gain weight, specifically muscle weight, through intensive weight training. So this gentleman would have what I would consider probably the highest protein need for a healthy person. And that I calculated at that rate of 1.7 grams per kilogram, and that's 130 grams of protein a day for him. And he can get that protein from just these 4 foods and those amounts. 6 ounces of chicken, a half a cup of beans, 6 ounces of tuna, and 3 glasses of milk. And that doesn't even include other foods that he consumes, grains, vegetables that would have protein in them as well. So it's just not difficult to get our protein from food, and most of us don't need a supplement. If somebody wants to use a supplement, I would look for that as a convenience factor and just doing it in moderation, maybe once every few days or at the most once a day, which is a lot different. I teach at MSU, and I have a lot of exercise and nutrition students who care about these things, and some of them are consuming these supplements all day long, So food first, and then use these products moderation for convenience if necessary. And then that brings me to my last point, which is a little note about vegetarianism. I've heard people say that, just kind of off the cuff, that how can a vegetarian get enough protein by not eating animal products, or it's just impossible. A lot of times people will ask me about their kids. I have a picky eater that doesn't eat any meat. How can I make sure he's getting his protein? And I have one of those myself. And so what I always talk about is, it's absolutely possible to get protein from plant foods. And we looked at that biological value chart. It just means that for somebody who doesn't eat any animal products at all, they just have to plan a little more carefully. So if they're not eating meat, but they're eating dairy or eggs, they're going to get protein from dairy or eggs, and I don't really worry about total protein. But if they're completely vegan, they're going to have to pay a little more attention to making sure that they're getting enough plant protein. So I've got a meal pattern up here with the different food groups and the number of servings that you would need for the average person to get enough protein. And you can see it's not a terrible amount of food. Now the foods are going to be a little higher fiber, having 6 servings of protein plants like nuts and seeds and beans. That's going to take a lot of chewing. And so sometimes people can kind of get filled up, especially little kids that are vegan can get very full on those types of foods and have a little issue with protein. But in general, most vegans are getting plenty of protein to meet their needs for those 9 essential amino acids and serve that purpose. That's going to conclude my presentation today. I have my references. Do you guys have any questions that you can think of or comments? I've handed out a sheet of paper that has some high protein food options to help you out. We do have a question over here, yes. The question is it important to pay attention to consuming protein after a workout? And yes, there is evidence to indicate that maximum muscle recovery occurs by consuming a protein source with a carbohydrate source, which could be met by a protein shake, within about 30 to 60 minutes after exercise. So that would be an example of somebody who's really trying to gain muscle mass, get the most benefit from the weight training aspect of their exercise to have some kind of good protein source. Me, I want to start a trend where we're eating beans after our workout. But it's not catching on at my gym. Any other questions you can think of? Yes, ma'am. Question is, what kind of fruits have protein? And fruits do not contain protein or significant amounts. So fruits are not a protein source. Now, are you speaking of that vegetarian meal pattern? Yeah. This would be a typical daily meal pattern with all the food groups, but not all of those contain protein. So the fruit is not going to contain significant amount. I just left that on there because it was a total meal plan. Yes, sir. That's a great question. So the question is, does almond milk have as much protein as soy milk? And the answer is no. Soy milk has higher protein than the other milk substitutes. Almond milk, coconut milk has much less protein. So that's an issue for vegans. What is their milk substitute that they're consuming?